September 1939. Britain had just declared war on Germany, and the Air Ministry faced a crisis that was killing aircrews at an alarming rate. Every time a reconnaissance aircraft slipped into enemy airspace to photograph German positions, it became an immediate target. The obvious solution seemed straightforward to everyone. Arm these machines to the teeth, add guns, armor plating, and let them fight their way out if intercepted. But that approach was failing spectacularly. The Bristol Blenheim was the RAF's main reconnaissance aircraft in those early months. Fitted with cameras yet still carrying its defensive armament, this twin-engine bomber lumbered across enemy skies at roughly 260 miles per hour. By contrast, Luftwaffe Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters could reach about 350 miles per hour and climb far faster than any British bomber could dive. The math was brutal and simple. You cannot outrun what is fundamentally faster than you, and you cannot outgun a dedicated fighter while you're hauling cameras and fuel instead of bombs. From September to December 1939, the losses mounted with sickening regularity. Blenheim crews crossed the German border, and many simply never came back. Those that did return arrived with aircraft so riddled by gunfire that ground crews marveled the machines had stayed airborne at all. The few successful sorties produced photographs, valuable photos, but at an intolerable cost. Some reconnaissance squadrons reported loss rates exceeding 50% on certain operations. For every 2 aircraft that took off, only 1 might return. Those were unsustainable numbers by any military standard. The Air Ministry's instinctive reaction followed conventional logic: add more guns, fit a heavier armor plating, increase defensive firepower. If Blenheims were vulnerable, the reasoning went, make them less vulnerable by protecting them. What this approach ignored was physics. Every pound of armor was a pound that robbed speed, lowered ceiling, and shortened range. The modified Blenheims became slower, more predictable, and easier targets. Luftwaffe pilots began to treat reconnaissance sorties as practice runs. The human cost went beyond statistics. These were experienced crews, trained observers who knew which German sites to photograph, pilots who could navigate deep into hostile airspace and bring their men home. Each loss meant months of training wasted, irreplaceable skill gone, and vital intelligence disrupted. By late autumn 1939, squadron commanders were filing ever more desperate reports. The current method was not working. Something fundamental had to change, but no one in authority quite knew what. French reconnaissance units faced the same dilemma. Their Poter 63 and Block 174 aircraft suffered similar attrition. The Germans, too, had problems when their Dornier Do-17 and Henkel HS-126 reconnaissance machines were intercepted by IAF Hurricanes over British lines. Everyone grasped the strategic need for aerial reconnaissance. Modern war demanded accurate knowledge of enemy dispositions, factory locations, defenses, yet the ways of getting that intelligence were grinding aircrews into dust. The photographs, when obtained, were pure gold. Officers could count tanks, identify aircraft, track troop moves, and spot new fortifications, but acquiring them looked like sending men into a shooting gallery where they were the targets. The Air Ministry needed a solution that did not accept catastrophic loss rates as the unavoidable price of reconnaissance. They needed something radical, something that challenged basic assumptions about military aircraft. They did not know it yet. Enter Frederick Sidney Cotton. Sidney, an Australian businessman and pilot who had spent the 1930s flying private aircraft across Europe. Cotton brought an outsider's eye that proved invaluable. Not a career IAF officer tied to doctrine, he was an entrepreneur who judged ideas by a single test. Does it work? In early 1939, even before war broke out, Cotton had made covert photographic flights over Germany in a civilian Lockheed 12A on business trips. The Secret Intelligence Service knew and were interested. From those flights, Cotton noticed a crucial fact. Speed and altitude kept him safe, not guns. When he flew high and fast, German defenses barely noticed him. When they did, they could not catch him. That observation crystallized into a radical hypothesis. What if military reconnaissance abandoned weapons entirely and focused on not being caught? The idea violated decades of military thinking, but Cotton had never been devoted to convention. He found an ally in Flight Lieutenant Maurice Babb's Longbottom, a young IAF officer pursuing the same line of thought. Longbottom had pored over Blenheim loss reports and reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Defensive armament was not defending anyone. Guns, gunners, and armor added weight and made aircraft slower and more vulnerable. They were carrying protection that actually increased the risk of being killed. The logic seemed perverse. In October 1939, Cotton and Longbottom submitted a joint proposal to the Air Ministry: take the Supermarine Spitfire, then the RAF's fastest fighter, and strip it of combat gear. Remove all 8 Browning machine guns and their ammunition, saving roughly 450 pounds. The armor behind the pilot, the gun sight, heating systems, and associated extras. Replace armament with cameras mounted in fuselage and wings, add extra fuel tanks for range, and paint the aircraft a pale duck-egg blue to blend with high-altitude skies. The resulting plane could cruise at around 370 miles per hour, reach altitude above 40,000 feet, and simply outrun any interceptor the Luftwaffe possessed. The Air Ministry's response bordered on apoplexy. Senior officers called the plan suicidal, insane, and a waste of Spitfires. How could you send pilots over enemy territory with no means of defending themselves? What if they met German fighters? The idea ran counter to doctrine that every aircraft needed defensive capability. Cotton's rebuttal was blunt. Your armed aircraft are being shot down at catastrophic rates, so obvious proof shows guns aren't helping. Try a different path or keep losing crews. The proposal also implicitly admitted Britain could not outfight the Luftwaffe in every scenario. The Spitfire was a symbol of British resolve. Stripping it of weapons felt like surrender to some, an admission of inadequacy. Cotton and Longbottom were asking the IAF to adopt a mentality alien to an institution built on confrontation. Sometimes running away is a smarter tactic. For many senior officers, that was a shift they could not make. But emotion and tradition did not alter physics. The numbers told a clear story once examined. A standard Spitfire MKI carried 8 Browning machine guns, each weighing around 10 pounds. Add the ammunition, roughly 300 rounds per gun, about 2,400 rounds total, and that added roughly 280 pounds. Include heating mechanisms, electrical systems, compressed air bottles for firing, and the structural reinforcement for recoil, and the total weight of the armament system approached 450 pounds. The armor, plating behind the pilot, added another 75 pounds. You were asking a Merlin engine to haul over 500 pounds of equipment that, for reconnaissance, served no purpose. Remove that burden and the transformation was immediate. The Spitfire's maximum speed rose from roughly 362 miles per hour to about 395 miles per hour at optimal altitude, and its rate of climb improved dramatically. A combat-loaded Spitfire might take about 9 minutes to reach 20,000 feet. Stripped for reconnaissance, the performance gains were decisive. A lightened reconnaissance variant could climb to the same altitude nearly 2 minutes faster, and it could continue climbing into layers of air so thin that ordinary fighters struggled to keep their engines running. At 40,000 feet, the modified Spitfire could cruise easily while a Messerschmitt Bf 1090 began to lose power above about 36,000 feet. The physics of interception made these differences decisive. When a German fighter spotted a reconnaissance machine, it needed to accelerate, climb to the same level, and maneuver into an attack position, all while the target was already moving away at top speed. If the reconnaissance aircraft sustained a 30 miles per hour speed advantage and was already high, the geometry of pursuit became almost hopeless. The interceptor had to fly a longer, curved path to close the gap, whereas the target continued on a near-straight course. By the time the German pilot had climbed to intercept altitude, the Spitfire might already be 5 or 10 miles ahead, and the separation would only increase. Put yourself in the Luftwaffe pilot's shoes. Ground observers would spot a high-flying aircraft, radio a nearby fighter station, and pilots would scramble. That warning and scramble phase alone took 5 to 8 minutes. The fighter then needed perhaps another 8 to 10 minutes to climb toward 35,000 feet. Meanwhile, the reconnaissance Spitfire had been covering ground at 6 to 7 miles per minute. By the time the German fighter reached a viable interception band, the target could be 80 to 100 miles away, possibly already back over friendly territory even if the interceptor pushed to maximum speed. Closing a 30 miles per hour performance gap over that distance demanded another 20 to 30 minutes of chasing, and few fighters carried enough fuel for such prolonged full-throttle pursuits. Fuel math favored the unarmed Spitfire heavily. Stripping weapons and ammunition freed space and weight for extra fuel tanks. Cotton's team fitted tanks in the wings and fuselage, raising capacity from roughly 85 gallons to about 230 gallons in some variants. That extended range from around 400 miles to well over 1,500 miles, permitting deep penetration sorties into Germany that standard fighters simply could not attempt. More fuel let crews fly higher for longer. High-altitude work required richer mixtures and consumed more petrol, but the disarmed Spitfire could afford that expense. Aerodynamics added further benefit. Removing gunport covers and fairings slightly reduced drag. At top speeds, every bit of streamlining counted because their resistance rises exponentially. Subsequent wind tunnel testing confirmed the cleaned-up reconnaissance Spitfires enjoyed marginally better lift-to-drag ratios than their combat-loaded sisters. Individually, these gains were small, but together they pushed the performance envelope past what any contemporary interceptor could match. Cotton did not wait for formal air ministry blessing. Skilled at operating in bureaucratic gray zones, by mid-October 1939 he had enough provisional authority to start modifications at Hounslow Aerodrome, a civilian field west of London. The choice of location was deliberate, away from IAF stations and officers who might raise awkward questions, and clear the rigid procedures of military bases. Cotton set up what he called the Hounslow Flight, though it used varying administrative labels to keep records conveniently vague. If the experiment failed, it could be quietly shelved. If it succeeded, others would happily claim credit. The first Spitfire arrived at Hounslow on the 20th of October, 1939. Civilian mechanics recruited by Cotton began the gutting process at once. They removed the 8 Browning guns, their ammunition feeds and cartridge chutes, dismantled the heating systems, compressed air firing bottles, and electrical firing gear, and unbolted the armor plate behind the pilot. Even the standard gun sight was taken out, pointless on an aircraft that would never be used in combat. Every removed item was catalogued and stored, partly for accountability, partly because no one was sure the experiment wouldn't be reversed in weeks. In the spaces left behind, the engineers installed cameras. The primary unit was an f/24 camera with an 8-inch lens mounted vertically in the fuselage behind the cockpit to photograph straight down through a new belly aperture. From 30,000 feet, that lens could resolve objects roughly 18 inches across, good enough to identify vehicle types and count personnel. 2 more F-24s went into the wing for oblique photography to capture side views of targets. Camera placement demanded careful balancing, put them too far off and the aircraft became tail-heavy, too far forward and the center of gravity shifted perilously. Fuel capacity received equal attention. Engineers fitted a 30-gallon tank in the rear fuselage and a 29-gallon cell behind the pilot where ammunition boxes had been. Extra tanks filled the wing voids left by gun mechanisms. Plumbing had to be routed with care. Fuel lines avoided control cables, vents prevented vapor lock at altitude, and shut-off valves let pilots manage weight distribution in flight. Getting the fuel system right consumed weeks. Early fits suffered fuel starvation at extreme heights until pumps were redesigned. Then came the paint. Cotton's pre-war reconnaissance work had taught him that dark camouflage was exactly wrong for high-altitude operations. Looking up from 30,000 foot, you stare into a pale blue sky. An aircraft painted standard IAF greens and browns stood out like a speck on a sheet. Cotton's solution was a custom-mixed pale duck-egg blue, often called PR blue, applied to fuselage, wings, and even propeller spinner. Against the high-altitude sky, the Spitfire became hard to spot. German pilots later reported seeing only empty sky while intelligence proved that British reconnaissance aircraft had flown overhead. Modifications extended to small but vital details that revealed Cotton's practical mindset. The cockpit received enhanced oxygen equipment and a more robust regulator for extended high-altitude work. The windscreen got coatings to prevent frosting where temperatures plunged toward minus 40 degrees Celsius. Navigation gear was upgraded with better compasses and drift indicators. These unarmed Spitfires would fly long, often solitary missions deep into enemy territory, so pilots needed every available advantage for navigation and survival. By mid-November 1939, the first modified Spitfire was ready. The pale blue aircraft sat on Hounslow's apron looking odd, too light, too clean, without the aggressive gun ports of a fighter. Maurice Longbottom, co-author of the proposal, would be the test pilot. If the idea failed spectacularly, at least one architect would share the consequences. The first target was Aachen, a German city near the Belgian border with railway hubs and military works. The route would carry Longbottom over roughly 150 miles of enemy airspace to photograph the area and return. Straightforward on paper, potentially fatal in execution. On the morning of the 18th of November, 1939 dawned cold and clear, perfect weather for reconnaissance but also for interception. Longbottom climbed into the cockpit, mindful of the Luftwaffe fighter bases along his path. Conventional wisdom said he was about to fly a defenseless aircraft into lethal skies. The ground crew had done their job. Now he would discover whether Cotton's physics-based argument would withstand German bullets. He opened the throttle, felt the lightened Spitfire accelerate with a responsiveness unlike any he had flown before, and lifted off into conditions that a few months earlier would have seemed suicidal. The climb advantage was immediate. Longbottom reached 33,000 feet in less time than his standard Spitfire training had taken to reach 25,000 feet free from hauling unnecessary weight. The Merlin engine pulled the aircraft up with brisk eagerness. He crossed the channel at altitude, the English coast shrinking behind him, and pressed into enemy airspace with only speed and height for protection. No guns, no armor, no escort, just him. Pilots even experimented with special high-climb interceptors and rocket-assisted takeoff attempts, but nothing worked. The PR Spitfire always had the edge. Each mission reinforced a lesson that had started with Longbottom's first flight. Speed, altitude, and invisibility were the best defense. What had begun as a risky gamble in 1939 had evolved into a doctrine that reshaped aerial reconnaissance. Cotton's radical idea, don't fight, don't get caught, transformed intelligence gathering into a science of precision and survival. By war's end, reconnaissance Spitfires had photographed every major front, from North Africa to the Arctic, from the Atlantic coast to the heart of Germany. They mapped bomb damage, tracked troop movements, and documented the final collapse of the Third Reich. Fewer than 1 in 20 were ever lost to enemy action. Their success validated Cotton's conviction that performance and foresight mattered more than firepower. The pale blue ghost had rewritten the rules of warfare, not through aggression, but through ingenuity. As victory drew closer in 1945, the IAF's photographic reconnaissance units had become indispensable to every major Allied command. Entire operations, strategic bombing campaigns, naval movements, even ground offensives, were planned using the imagery gathered by these unarmed aircraft. Analysts at Medmenham, the RAF's Photo Interpretation Center in Buckinghamshire, worked around the clock examining thousands of negatives each day. Their discoveries went far beyond routine mapping. It was PR Spitfire photography that first revealed the existence of Germany's V-1 and V-2 launch sites in northern France. The clarity of the images, showing the distinctive ski-shaped ramps, allowed Allied bombers to strike the sites before the new weapons could be deployed at scale. After the war, the lessons of Cotton's approach reshaped air reconnaissance worldwide. The principle that speed, altitude, and stealth outweigh armament became doctrine. The United States developed the U-2 and later the State Route 71 Blackbird on precisely that logic, aircraft designed to fly so high and fast that interception was impossible. In Britain, the lineage continued through the jet-powered Spitfire PR-19 and into the early jet age with the Meteor and Canberra reconnaissance variants. Sidney Cotton himself remained a maverick. Although he clashed repeatedly with IAF bureaucracy and never received the level of recognition he deserved, his influence endured. Pilots who had flown his Blue Ghost spoke of the eerie calm at altitude, alone, unarmed, 40,000 feet above enemy territory, camera shutters clicking where guns once fired. To them, Cotton's idea was not cowardice, it was clarity. It turned reconnaissance from a suicide mission into a science, proving that survival and intelligence could coexist. By the time peace returned to Europe, Cotton's philosophy had become an axiom of modern warfare. You cannot shoot what you cannot reach, and you cannot outfight what you cannot see. Pilots grew almost obsessively determined to bring down these reconnaissance planes. Adolf Goland, one of Germany's top-scoring aces, made several attempts to intercept PR Spitfires, and never managed a single engagement. The pale blue aircraft would appear on the horizon. He'd push his throttle to the limit, and still watch the elusive shape drift steadily out of reach. By the time he climbed to the altitude the Spitfire had occupied, it was already miles away and still climbing. Other veteran Luftwaffe pilots told the same story, endless climbs after targets that remained maddeningly beyond reach. The psychological toll was immense. Fighter units existed to defend German skies, yet these British aircraft photographed German cities, military bases, and factories with total impunity. Ground troops demanded to know why the fighters hadn't stopped them. Civilians wondered why the vaunted air defenses seemed helpless. The pilots had no real answer. They tried desperately, but the physics made success impossible. That helplessness eroded morale far more deeply than any combat defeat. German intelligence understood exactly what those photographs meant. When Allied bombers hit factories that had been photographed days earlier, the link was obvious. When invasion forces landed on beaches PR Spitfires had mapped in detail, the chain of intelligence was undeniable. The Luftwaffe was losing the reconnaissance war outright and could do nothing to change it. By 1943, Luftwaffe doctrine had quietly conceded. Standing orders stated that intercepting aircraft operating above 40,000 feet was improbable, and that any pursuit failing to close within 5 minutes should be abandoned. It was surrender disguised as a procedure. They had tried everything, and nothing worked. The concept Cotton and Longbottom had fought to prove that reconnaissance should rely on performance, not guns, did not die with the war. It became the foundation for every generation of surveillance aircraft that followed. When the United States began developing high-altitude reconnaissance platforms in the Cold War, engineers looked directly to the PR Spitfire's record for guidance. The result was a Lockheed U-2, introduced in 1955, which took Cotton's principle to the extreme. Operational ceilings above 70,000 feet, no armament whatsoever. Safety through altitude and speed. For years it worked flawlessly. U-2s mapped Soviet bases, tracked missile sites, and gathered intelligence impossible to obtain otherwise. When France's Gary Powers was shot down over Sverdlovsk on the 1st of May, 1960, it wasn't by a fighter. It was by an S-75 Divina surface-to-air missile, a weapon that hadn't existed in Cotton's day. Even that success required multiple launches and only succeeded because Powers' route passed directly through a dense SAM network. The core truth remained: altitude and speed equal protection. That truth reached its ultimate expression with the State Route 71 Blackbird, entering service in 1966. Flying above 85,000 feet at Mach 3.2, it embodied Cotton's philosophy in purest form. No weapons, no armor, defense by physics alone. When missiles launched, the State Route 71 simply accelerated and outran them. Soviet fighter pilots faced the same futile geometry their predecessors had endured against PR Spitfires, only at triple the speed and twice the altitude. The math had not changed. You cannot intercept what exceeds your performance envelope. Modern reconnaissance now relies heavily on unmanned systems, yet the doctrine remains unchanged. The Lockheed U-2S still flies, essentially the same design conceived in the 1950s from wartime lessons. Drones like the RQ-4 Global Hawk follow the same logic. Unarmed, relying on altitude, sensors, and endurance rather than defenses. Even armed surveillance craft carry weapons for ground strikes, not dogfights. The mission remains to avoid combat, not seek it. Sidney Cotton himself never received the recognition he earned. He clashed with IAF bureaucracy, was pushed out of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit by 1940, and spent the rest of the war on the margins. The institution he defied never forgave him for being right when they were wrong. He died in 1969, mostly forgotten outside aviation circles. Yet every reconnaissance aircraft that values speed and performance over guns operates on principles he proved when doing so seemed insane. The mad idea was, in truth, the right one. Strip away the weapons, abandon reflexive defense, and accept that sometimes not fighting is the smartest form of survival. It was heresy in 1939, a challenge to courage itself, to admit you couldn't outfight the enemy in every sky. But physics didn't care about pride. The unarmed Spitfires came back again and again, photographed every target assigned, and lived where armed planes died. The data was undeniable, and eventually even the most stubborn commanders had to concede. What had seemed suicidal in October 1939 became standard doctrine by 1945, and remains a cornerstone of reconnaissance aviation to this day. Sometimes, the impossible idea is simply the correct one.